Labas Vitas. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Somebody said to me this morning, on the second day of a conference... Sorry. I'm a walker. Do you know what I mean? I walk about when I speak, and being chained to the microphone doesn't come naturally to me, so forgive me. Somebody said to me this morning that the second day of a conference is the day when you feel a dip. So I'm hoping what I have to say today, which I feel is very important, will be enough to engage you and provoke you and stimulate you. I'm certain many of you may not agree with some of the things I say, but that's fine by me. My topic today is how we can understand leading for equity and learning, and it's the equity that I'm particularly focused on. Debates about equality, equity, social justice, inclusion, and many other related terms have been well rehearsed over an extended period of time, and I'm assuming an understanding amongst this audience that equity, the goal of equity, is more than just giving equal opportunities. Rather, equity is about ensuring that all the learners throughout Europe acquire the attitudes, knowledge, and skills to enable them to live a life they value and to offer value to society without encountering the kind of barriers which are unnecessary and which cause them detriment. I think there's widespread agreement about the importance, indeed the fundamental importance of this goal, and there's a reasonably substantial research base suggesting the steps we might take. There have been related aims embedded in successive waves of legislation in nations and in Europe, and they're embedded in benchmarks to be achieved by 2020. Yet, this apparent progress, I think, is deceptive. Gaps are widening still between the performance, for example, of girls and boys, between native-born and migrant students. There are large disparities in the achievement and attainment of pupils in every nation, even those that feature at the top of the league tables for attainment and for equity. Nowhere is there room for complacency. The gaps, the disparities, are not wholly explicable by differences in innate ability or even by socioeconomic status. It would seem that some nations, some schools, some departments are better than others at reducing inequity. We know that those who have stigmatized characteristics, such as their gender, their ethnicity, their migrant status, sexuality, and so on, face daily discrimination in our schools. Inequity is a daily experience for many of our learners, to their detriment and, I believe, to our shame. In a paper commissioned for the European Union, Levin said that two things were necessary to address the situation. Will, that's the determination to do something about this, and capacity, that's our ability to put our ideas into action. In this keynote presentation, I want to suggest that we look at how we understand those two things, the will to achieve a change, an improvement, and the capacity to do so. Well, the starting point is not encouraging. There's considerable literature from sociology that suggests, indeed insists, that education is not a vehicle for reducing inequity. On the contrary, it's primarily a transmitter of existing power relations, and that the instinct of self-protection of the advantaged is so strong that whatever we put in place, it may be overturned by new strategies from the privileged. Again, and yet, we cannot believe that the fate of every individual is shaped by their socioeconomic background or any other aspect of their being. I think there are some key points that might be made about ways we might begin to break this cycle of reproduction which education is so good at. When I was thinking about where to start with this presentation, it took me back to an example of a place and time where, above all others, there should have been the will to change. And that was South Africa in 1994. At the end of apartheid, when decades of using education to oppress the majority in the most iniquitous way came to an end, and the majority were determined to use education to transform their nation and transform the life chances of individuals. At that time, Jonathan Jansen, who'd been a principal of a school and who became the first black dean of what was previously an all-white university, took over the role of transforming this university department and to make it more equitable. He wrote autobiographically at that time, "Hard emotional work, my soul felt it, difficult political work, an endless confrontation with power." So even at that time of intense determination to use education to achieve equity, somebody who tried to do so found it a really immensely difficult task. His vice-chancellor at the time put it to him like this: "I've turned the ship around. The trouble is, it's still floating in the same direction." The way power relations were embedded in education made it impossible for them to switch to a direction of equity. Well, I would suggest that European and national policy, and indeed leaders in schools, have tried to turn their ship around in the direction of equity. But the problem is, it's still sailing in the direction of inequity. Quite a lot of the changes are based on rational, technical solutions. And to follow this metaphor, what I think people are doing is changing the direction of the rudder or setting the sails somewhat differently in the hope that that will change the direction of the ship. But there's a problem. And the problem is that underneath that ship are tides and currents which are so strong that whatever is done on the surface to try to change direction, the ship is still carried more or less in the direction it was previously. And it's these tides and currents that I want to focus on for a short space in this keynote. I'm only going to pick out a few examples. There are many tides and currents, but just a few illustrations of this may help you understand what I mean. They are, and I stress, this is beliefs about, this is not the thing itself, it is the way people believe about the nature of learning, the nature of fairness, the impact of particular characteristics, such as first language, and the effect of disadvantaged students on the learning of others. So starting then with the first one, innate ability. Well, we take for granted that we are experienced professionals and we know about ability and how to nurture it. But I would argue that one of the tides carrying us forward in Europe is assumptions about ability in students. In the US and my home country, the UK, we tend to assume that innate ability is an absolute. And the result of that is that children and young people who are seen not to have a natural ability or an affinity with a particular subject are encouraged to move to another area. They're diverted onto a different kind of curriculum. Other cultures may not think in this way about learning at all. In some Asian cultures, the answer to lack of attainment is more support and more effort on the part of the student. It's not assumed the student can't, It's assumed the student can, but to achieve, more is needed on both sides. More support, more effort. In Europe, I think many learners are moved on to a less testing curriculum when people make assumptions about their ability, often linked to their socio-economic background, and that less testing curriculum is often delivered by less experienced teachers. So they are doubly disadvantaged. Then there's how we think about fairness. I'd be interested to survey this audience if there were time. Here is an extract from a survey of learners across, as you can see, several European countries. The learners were asked whether they believed for a secondary school, a high school, to be fair, teachers must give the same attention to all pupils, or, to be fair, teachers must give more attention to the least able. Can you see how culturally shaped is the notion of fairness here? The UK is outstanding for not thinking that more attention should be given to the least able, or at least those perceived as the least able. But in all the countries surveyed, the majority, and sometimes the large majority, were not in favour of giving extra help to students perceived as least able. It seems to me that most students adhere to an equal opportunities approach, where fairness is everybody receiving an identical experience. The net result of that is those who start in front stay in front. Those who start behind, generally, stay behind. In my own research in the UK, setting a baseline of evidence for high school education, I came across many parents expressing the same opinion, and many young people. In one quote, one child was very indignant that the school was giving praise and rewards to others for their effort. This, in his view, resulted in a reward going to the ones who don't actually do any work. Children who tried but didn't attain were not to be rewarded or praised. That was to go strictly to those who attained. Asked about the quality of education received, in all countries, about 3/4 of respondents felt, and this is important, the same quality of education was received by all learners. They all received the same quality of education. Yet elsewhere in the survey, in answer to the questions you can see in the first column here, there was awareness of discrepancy. Certain pupils get praised or rewarded more than others. Certain more able students get treated better. Some are punished more than others. Now, I'm aware these are perceptions. These are perceptions of children and young people. But nevertheless, the perception is the reality. And given the majority nature of some of these findings, I'd be surprised if there weren't some reason to think seriously about what these young people are saying. It would appear that they simultaneously believe that every child gets the same chance and that there is differential achievement. They believe contradictory things. There's a very substantial literature suggesting that school curricula, pedagogy, and assessment are skewed in favour of the middle-class learner. And Brown reminds us we don't really see through our eyes or hear through our ears, but through our beliefs. And often, in my experience, and supported by research, parents, learners, teachers, and leaders believe they are completely fair in what they're doing, and that the roots of inequity lie elsewhere, in the problems the learner brings to the school, their socioeconomic background, their language status, or whatever. And despite any evidence to the contrary, the problem is located elsewhere. And this is because, I think, educators are genuinely and deeply committed to achieving inequity and recognizing their own involvement in sustaining inequity is too uncomfortable for most. Then there is the impact of personal characteristics. In 2012, a review for the European Union documented inequity in relation to the characteristics embedded in legislation: gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, family background. And a complex picture emerged, with some groups outperforming others, but nevertheless, overall, overwhelming evidence that those with these stigmatized characteristics are at risk within schools of detriment because of that characteristic. And I just, again, want to give you a couple of illustrations of this. First, language. The language of instruction being a second language for a learner is often seen as problematic, and it leads to disparities in attainment, is the argument, assumed often to be linked to socioeconomic background or other factors. And yet, the same report points out that this isn't happening elsewhere in the world. Even when socioeconomic background is controlled, that kind of disparity does not exist in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Then if we look at another example, ethnicity. I think teachers and leaders are implicated in the disadvantage experienced by minority ethnic learners on many occasions. For example, again, there's a growing diversity of learners in many parts of Europe, but not a growing diversity of staff equally. And I would suggest that discrimination in the appointment process for teachers and leaders persists. When in the school, there's discrimination in terms of leaders and teachers' perception of learners. If you're seen as other, if you understand what I mean by that, if you're outside the mainstream, outside the norm, you're more likely to be labelled as having special needs or behavioural difficulties or some other disadvantage. And overall, widespread racism and discrimination. In other words, if you happen to be a child who is perceived as being outside a norm, you are likely to receive some detriment in your education. However, the problem is generally located in the learner, him or herself, and I think that's a deeply problematic starting position for trying to achieve equity. Tanya Fitzgerald puts the case, I think, very well here in this slide. Social justice is an impossibility if it rests on notions of deficit. And she gives us a challenge. How might we redefine social justice if we see learners as bringing capital to the school, not bringing problems to the school? If we see what they have as desirable rather than in need of remediation? Well, I think we have multiple problems, but one of them is I don't think the research from educational leadership actually is sufficient to help leaders address these challenges. I think it's too limited. I think we need to look to other disciplines where there are perhaps deeper understandings of the processes that are at work here. For example, if you look at the discipline of psychology, there is considerable research showing that when teachers believe they're being fair and leaders believe they're being fair, they are entirely sincere in that. But on a daily basis, there are multiple transmissions of belief in inequity through our eye contact, through our tone of voice, through our body language, which is entirely unconscious. On a daily basis, we are recreating inequity with some of our learners without even meaning to. So to draw these threads together, widely held cultural beliefs about, for example, the nature of ability, what constitutes fairness, a deficit view of those deemed other as some of the currents and tides that are carrying the ship of education on, sailing in the direction as previously. Now, if you genuinely want to change that direction, there are great risks involved. For example, parents fleeing a school that they believe is going to drop in its standards, teachers leaving, students objecting sometimes to what they see as unfair practice. In the face of such deterrence, it's hardly surprising that whatever the rhetoric of being committed to equity, there may in fact be very limited will to change. Pursuing the good for others will generally cease if it's at too high a cost to the self. To pursue equity, policymakers and school leaders currently focus on groups of students they perceive as needing additional support, and they see this as a deficit issue. So I would suggest the first problem, the first challenge, and as with most wicked problems, it's very difficult, is just to recognise what the issue is. This is a quote from a governor in a school in England looking at what needed to happen for his school to improve. And his conclusion was that it isn't the learners that need to be different, it's the adults who had to change. To achieve equity, I'm arguing, the issue is not so much the technical ones about changing curricula, pedagogy, and so on. They may need to happen, but the fundamental issue, the tides and currents underneath, are the adults in schools and in the wider community. So, if, as I've argued, we need to start building will and capacity, how might we, as policymakers and leaders, start to work together to move in the direction of equity? Well, the first problem that I think we've got is that the change models that are taught in most preparation and development programs and in the literature are nearly all based on collegial processes, building support, building agreement, and so on. And I don't argue with that in many ways. But in this particular instance, for all the reasons I've outlined, that we have embedded tides of self-interest and unconscious action, it may not be that simple. Simply getting agreement from those who see their self-interest going in another direction may not be a possibility. At the moment, I think a lot of the result of that is ignoring the issue. A review of the development of leadership skills in OECD countries, 155 pages long. One reference to equity, and none at all to issues such as gender or ethnicity. I would suggest that many development programs adopt a functionalist approach, aiming to strengthen the performance of the existing system rather than to transform it. Often standards or competencies are seen as the answer to injecting equity into the mix, but there is no evidence at the moment that standards or competence actually have a positive effect on moving the education ship towards greater equity. In fact, there's a contrary argument that they simply provide a means of leaders confirming that they do these things, whether they do them or not. The international study of the preparation of principals explained that its starting question was, to what extent do principal preparation programs prepare candidates for the reality of life as a school principal? And they also say that there wasn't, as yet, any convincing answer to this. I would suggest that to prepare for equity, we need a different starting question. To what extent do principal preparation programs prepare leaders to transform schools? I think at the moment, mostly, they prepare people to survive in schools, and that's not the same thing at all. Capacity building in preparation and development programs needs to challenge leaders much more seriously to reflect deeply and critically on their own attitudes and orientations to learners, their own cultural assumptions. In particular, they need to be empowered not only to understand their own cultural assumptions, but how they might challenge these in those they work with, teachers, learners, parents. For example, about innate ability, or about the nature of those that are seen as other and assumptions about their abilities. I don't think this happens much at the moment. Those who lead and participate in preparation programs may be quite comfortable with what the evidence suggests currently is prevalent lip service to diversity and equity issues. Moving beyond that may be quite difficult for those who lead programs who themselves may not be educated adequately in equity issues. And participants being asked to move out of their comfort zone may not be happy. Some may respond by requests or demands to move to other, more important, more mainstream things, or counterattack, suggesting that inequity lies in other things, socioeconomic background and so on. So people opt out, physically sometimes, more usually psychologically. So this is research from a leader development program describing the reaction of some of the participants to being asked to focus more centrally on equity. Finding the means to break this cycle and to break this silence, and to help leaders learn in ways that empowers them, and it will help them empower teachers, can't draw on extensive guidance from research, but there is some. There are detailed suggestions, for example, on how these kind of strategies might be embedded in development and preparation programs. There are other commentators who provide frameworks as to how equity might be more centrally placed in development and preparation programs. Most of this work comes from the US. Within the UK, within Europe, the emphasis is more usually on specific issues of migrant status, ethnicity, and so on. There is some guidance. I'm not suggesting there is a single way, or even ever going to be a consensus on how to prepare leaders for equity. But I am suggesting that our current practice in no way achieves this, and that equity needs to be placed much more centrally in the design of programs, and in a meaningful way. I'm quite interested in this conference, going back to the discussion that was held by the partners last year sometime on formulating the questions driving the conference and whether equity ought to be a separate issue or embedded in everything. And there was agreement that it should be embedded in everything. My observation, watching what's happening in the conference, is that because it's embedded in everything, it's tended mostly to slide off the agenda. It's a word that pops up, but it hasn't been central. And I think it needs to be central. How to persuade people? Well, the moral argument, I don't think, is going to be very effective. The argument about justice has never proved particularly effective in education. There may be an instrumental argument that can be brought to bear. Somebody yesterday referred to Zeppelins. Do you remember linking ideas? Do you remember the Zeppelin was a way of moving from A to B that seemed terribly efficient at the time, new technology, except it ended up in the end in a conflagration of flames. Now, I'm not suggesting that Europe is going to go up in flames at any moment, but I am suggesting that the ship of education is a dangerous mode of transport at the moment, with increasing unhappiness in many parts of Europe at the level of inequity that's resulting. And we need to get out and find a different way sooner rather than later. How am I doing for time? If most leaders can be persuaded that equity needs to be placed much more centrally in what they do, they're going to need a lot of support to challenge teachers, learners, and parents. Teachers will be absolutely certain that they are committed to equity and act for equity every day of their professional lives. So, for example, we might provide more evidence to leaders that this is not necessarily the case. Going back to the survey I shared with you earlier, I think there isn't time to go into all these results in detail, but I think they're very interesting. If you look here, again, the same countries involved and how many learners as a percentage agreed with these statements, interestingly, students with rich parents don't seem to be perceived as having a better deal than others. But those who are hard-working are nearly always seen as being treated better. For example, in my research in England, I heard many really heartbreaking narratives from young people who had struggled with some aspect of the curricula. Their efforts dropped. As a result, the teacher's attention dropped. They tried even less hard, and they got into a spiral that often resulted in their lack of attainment at best, exclusion at worst. Again, I understand these are subjective perceptions, but there is so much evidence pointing in one direction, I think we must take such perceptions seriously. So leaders will have an unremitting and emotionally draining task of persuading the whole school community that all learners can achieve, and that the need is to adjust everything to meet the positives that are brought by students into schools, and that doing so doesn't jeopardize standards in a way that is inclusive rather than just standards as interpreted by the middle class. How then can policymakers help in this task? Well, I'm going to suggest that, of course, there's great variation across Europe. I understand that. But I'd suggest two trends generally, where policy identifies groups of learners who are in deficit and require remediation, and that tightening accountability will raise school performance and so reduce attainment disparities. And I would suggest we're back to changing the rudder and tweaking the sails and not dealing with the underlying tides and currents. So policymakers can help, I think, in a couple of ways that requires leadership. It doesn't require so much pieces of paper with policy written on. It requires leadership. And if leadership is about setting a vision, communicating, setting a narrative, that is what I think policymakers need to be doing. On two fronts. Firstly, they need to change the narrative about learners. They need to change the discourse so that we don't see groups of learners as the problem. What we see as the problem is schools who don't meet learners' needs, all learners' needs, and that there is a requirement on society to meet all learners' needs, not, as is often the case, a kind of impatient, oh dear me, we've got to address the problems of this group or that group. It's a bit of a nuisance because it takes more resource. So they could lead in that way. Secondly, they could support leaders. Easy to say, difficult to do. Leaders will have a very difficult task. They will encounter resistance. There's no doubt about it. In most cases, they will encounter resistance. And resistance from those groups whose support policymakers often court. Leaders will make mistakes because this is difficult. They will need to take risks. The current accountability context doesn't encourage risks. doesn't allow mistakes, it punishes. So policymakers need to, and I come back to that word that kept being mentioned yesterday repeatedly, they need to enable a climate of trust. Because if you don't trust leaders in schools to lead changes of the kind I've outlined, against resistance, with some paths that go positively and some that do not, if they're not empowered in that way, then I suggest that a failure of leadership on the part of policymakers and of leaders in school organisations will mean that whatever we keep doing technically to change the set of the sails, to tweak the rudder, to repaint the outside of the ship and all the other structural, rational things we do, won't in the end make a transformational difference. And the ship may move a few degrees, but not change direction in the way that we need it to if we seriously want education to move in the direction of greater equity. Thank you very much.